When the story broke, it started crossing the wires early in the morning, and it was billed as an armed robbery at the high-value cargo area at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. And it could have been $500,000, and then it could have been $1 million. And then the figure started to climb, and we started seeing zeros that we hadn't seen in any armed robbery, that hadn't even been talked about since the Brinks job in Boston in the 50s. And pretty much before lunchtime, you knew that this was probably the biggest cash robbery in U.S. history.
Though never confirmed, the take was estimated to be between $5 and $6 million. And as the New York tabloids speculated about possible suspects, the police and FBI knew who was most likely to be behind the crime.
The FBI and the New York City Police Department had a pretty good idea who committed the robbery within 2 or 3 days. In fact, within a day of the robbery, there were 2 crews that were targeted as those responsible for the robbery. The John Gotti crew in Howard Beach and the Jimmy Burke crew in Ozone Park.
Undercover detectives prowled the bars in those 2 areas, looking for information.
Would send detectives out, have a cocktail, go in with a girl, sit down, start talking to certain people. And I would say within 24 hours we had the whole story.
The behavior of the Roberts Lounge gang was suspicious. Though Jimmy had given only a small percentage of the money to his men, they still celebrated in a very public manner.
These guys would go out and spend it immediately, either on broads, on booze, on drugs, on racetracks, on cars. I mean, the mentality of these people, I think collectively they had the IQ of an ashtray. They really couldn't function in the real world.
It was the holiday season. Everybody was drinking, partying, buying all kinds of crazy gifts for their girlfriends. And I mean, it was insane.
These were not the faculty of Harvard. When you think of organized crime, a lot of people hearken back to the images that they know, images from The Godfather, that these are men of honor, that they're fairly sophisticated, somewhat Machiavellian. A lot of these guys were just plain morons.
Despite the crew's reckless spending spree, the task of proving them guilty didn't prove to be easy. Jimmy's reputation as a vicious killer meant people with information would not risk going on the record with any allegations.
Knowing and proving are always 2 different things in law enforcement. Very quickly, everybody knew that this was Jimmy Burke and his crew behind the robbery, but being able to prove that required one of 2 things. You either needed forensic evidence like Jimmy Burke or Tommy DeSimone or Henry Hill's fingerprints. You needed to recover some of that money during a search at one of their premises, or you needed somebody talking about it. And at the time immediately following the robbery, they didn't have any of those things.
Authorities did, however, catch a break when they recovered the van described by a witness as being used in the heist. Part of the master plan had been for crew member Stephen Stax Edwards to get rid of the van by having it crushed in a mob-controlled junkyard the night of the robbery.
He got drunk and loaded that night. He was supposed to stay straight, take the truck to Jersey, have it put in a masher and crushed. He proceeded to leave it in the city, fingerprints all over it, and go back home and go to sleep.
When word got out to the press that fingerprints had been found, Jimmy Burke knew they had to belong to Stax. The rest of the crew had worn gloves. Burke decided that Stax's connection to the gang had to be eliminated.
Stax was the first one to get whacked. He got whacked a couple of days after the robbery.
Stax lived in the neighborhood, about 120th Street, 114th Avenue. Angelo Seppi and Tommy DeSimone did, in fact, go up to his apartment. Stax was in the middle of eating, and in fact, he was in the middle of eating some form of chicken dinner. And they walked in. Tommy DeSimone shot and killed Stax with a piece of chicken left in his mouth.
Soon after this murder, bookie Marty Krugman, who had brought the robbery to Jimmy, was killed. Burke was beginning to cover his tracks. Surveillance on Jimmy and his crew was stepped up.
There was hundreds of feds and detectives following every single move we made. You know, they just followed us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
These guys knew they were being tailed by the FBI. They knew they were being tailed by the NYPD. There was a running joke at the time that, you know, if you were one of the half dozen people being looked at heavy in the Lufthansa case, if you went across the Triborough Bridge, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority made like a lot of money that day because there was 8 cars behind you.
Electronic surveillance was also used, but with limited success.
Jimmy Burke was an extremely sophisticated, clever person, and was able to neutralize any attempts that we made at conducting electronic surveillance. We were unable to gain entry to his home. Most of his meetings were taking place at his home. If he met outside of his home, he was meeting in Robert's Lounge, which was just filled with people, so that it defied electronic surveillance. All you would get was a lot of noise. You wouldn't be able to pick up any particular conversations. We put bugs in cars, but it was in the era of disco, and we got a lot of disco music, we got a lot of engine noise, we got a lot of heaters, we got a lot of people, you know, arguing with their girlfriends.
Though it netted little useful evidence, increased attention did begin to cause problems within the larger structure of the mafia families.
It put tremendous heat on the mob in general. The other families didn't like that. If you looked at the newspaper back then, they were reporting practically in real time. The information coming in from the street, the information coming in from informants. There was a whole lot of information out there, and that made people very uncomfortable.
While law enforcement kept the heat on the mobsters, they also pursued another angle. They began to focus on the suspected inside man on the job, Louis Werner.
The first step in that process was to target Peter Grunwald. We got information from people that Grunwald had actually come up with a plan.
McDonald's office convinced Grunwald to testify against his old friend Werner. That, coupled with testimony from several other people that Werner had bragged to about the crime, gave prosecutors a very strong case. On May 16, 1979, Louis Werner was convicted for his role in the Lufthansa heist. Even with the conviction, however, Werner refused to cooperate with authorities in their pursuit of the Roberts Lounge crew.
Somehow, this guy was under the delusion that his conviction was going to be reversed. It was, in my view, it was a slam dunk, and he was given a bump steer by somebody.
Meanwhile, Burke's murder spree continued.
The night that the jury returned its verdict, Frenchie McMahon and Joe Buda were executed. Their bodies were discovered the next morning in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn.
Besides eliminating potential witnesses, Burke's murderous actions were also motivated by dollars and cents.
You know, the greed overtook him, and he went completely insane, you know, and I guess he had a lot of influence from the other bosses of the family because they figured it was just easier to kill all the other people rather than to give them their filets. Rather than give them $400,000 or $500,000 apiece, it was easier to put a quarter bullet in the head, you know? So he started eliminating everyone at that point.
By the summer of 1979, 6 months after the heist, 8 men associated with the robbery were dead. Louis Werner, the man behind bars, didn't know the names or faces of anyone left alive. And over $5 million in unmarked bills were still missing.